In the village of Umun, there was a kind but weary man named Emeka. He lived in a small hut with his son Chimdi, who was his only joy. Emeka's wife had passed away during a storm, leaving him to care for Chimdi all by himself. Every day, Emeka worked tirelessly, but no matter how much he did, there was never enough food. Chimdi was growing weaker, and it broke Emeka's heart every time he saw his son's hungry, sad eyes. Emeka woke up early each day before the sun rose. He carried heavy firewood, fetched water from the stream, and farmed the dry, cracked soil. Yet despite all his efforts, the little food he grew wasn't enough to fill their bellies. The market in the village offered no solace. Everything was so expensive that even one yam was more than he could afford. No matter how much he tried, it was never enough. Chimdi was a cheerful boy who loved to laugh and play with other children. But lately he had grown quiet. His cheeks were no longer round, and he was too tired to run around. Emeka would sit by his side, stroking his hair and whispering, "Papa is trying, my son. We will be fine." But inside, Emeka wasn't sure if things would ever get better. He prayed and hoped, but his struggles seemed endless. One night, after a particularly grueling day, Emeka sat outside his hut and looked up the stars. The moon was full and bright, and the sky was silent. Tears rolled down his face as he whispered, "I just need one day to rest, one day without pain, hunger, or sorrow." He didn't know why he said it aloud, but it felt as though the stars were listening. He repeated his wish softly. Suddenly, the wind stopped blowing, and the air became unnervingly still. The night, once calm, now felt cold and strange. A shadow began to form at the edge of the forest near Emeka's hut. His heart raced as he stood. "Who is there?" he called out, his voice shaking. The shadow grew larger until it stood before him. It was a tall figure cloaked in black with a voice as soft as the wind. "You called for me," the figure said. Emeka trembled but did not run. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am Death," the figure replied. Emeka gasped, stepping back, but Death did not move closer. "You wished for rest," it said, "and I have come to grant it." Emeka's fear turned into confusion. "Rest?" he asked. Death nodded. "You can borrow me for one day. You will sleep in peace, free from all pain and sorrow." Emeka hesitated. "Just one day?" he asked. "And I will wake up afterward?" Death's hollow voice replied, "Yes, you will return after one day. But you must understand, death is not a game. If you borrow me too often, I may not give your life back." Emeka thought about it and nodded. "I just need one day," he said. Death raised its shadowy hand and touched Emeka's forehead. The world around him grew dark, and Emeka fell asleep. The next morning, Chimdi woke up and found his father lying still on the floor. "Papa," he called out, shaking him gently. Emeka did not move. Panic filled the boy's heart. He ran out of the hut, shouting, "Help! My papa is not waking up!" Villagers rushed to Emeka's hut and saw his lifeless body. Some wept, others whispered prayers. "He has left us," one elder said sadly. They began preparing to bury him. As the villagers gathered to discuss the burial, the village's native doctor arrived. He was a wise and respected man who understood things no one else could. He looked at Emeka's body and said, "His spirit has not traveled far. Do not bury him yet. We must wait until tomorrow." The villagers were puzzled, but trusted the native doctor's wisdom. They left Emeka's body in his hut and prayed for his soul. The next morning, just as the sun rose, Emeka gasped for air and opened his eyes. His heart was beating again and he was alive. Villagers screamed and ran to his hut, amazed. "He's back!" they shouted. Chimdi hugged his father tightly, crying tears of joy. Emeka smiled and whispered, "I'm here, my son." The villagers called it a miracle, but Emeka knew the truth. He had borrowed death and returned to life. At first he felt relieved. The rest he had experienced in death was peaceful and calming. He felt no hunger, no pain, no sorrow. But when the hard days returned, days of hunger and exhaustion, Emeka remembered the quiet peace of death. One night, he made the same wish. "Death, I call you again. Let me borrow your peace for a few days." Death appeared and reminded him, "Do not borrow me too often." Emeka agreed. This time, he borrowed Death for 3 days. Before he closed his eyes, he left Chimdi with his neighbors, telling them he needed to visit a faraway farm deep in the forest. He lay down on the soft grass and let his soul leave his body. For 3 days, he rested in peace, free from all the pain. On the 4th morning, his soul returned, and he woke up feeling light and calm. After returning to life, Emeka resumed his struggles. He hugged Chimdi tightly, hoping his son would never know the truth about where he had gone. The villagers believed his story about visiting another farm, but some whispered that there was something unusual about him. Emeka didn't care. The peace he had found in borrowing death became his secret escape. Whenever life became too hard, he would wander into the forest and borrow death again, staying far away for a few days before returning to life. It felt like his only way to survive. As time passed, Emeka grew more comfortable borrowing death. At first, he only asked for a single day, then 3 days, and then a week. Each time, he wandered deeper into the forest, far from the village. He feared that one day the villagers might try to bury him before he could return. In the forest, no one would find his body. He would lie still, waiting for his soul to come back. It felt safe, even though he knew it was dangerous. Chimdi grew worried about his father's frequent disappearances. "Papa, why do you always go away?" he asked one evening. Emeka stroked his son's hair and said softly, "I go to find food for us, my son." "Don't worry, Papa always comes back." But Chimdi wasn't convinced. He often cried when Emeka left, afraid he wouldn't return. Emeka tried to ignore his son's tears, but his heart ached. He told himself it was for the best. Borrowing death gave him the strength to keep going for his son. One day, Emeka borrowed death for 2 whole weeks. Life had become unbearable, and he longed for the peaceful rest he had come to cherish. He walked into the forest deeper than ever before and found a quiet spot beneath an ancient tree. Lying down, he whispered, "Death, I am ready." The cold touch of death took him once again, and his soul drifted into silence. The villagers noticed his absence, but they assumed he had traveled far to find work. While Emeka's body lay still in the forest, Chimdi waited at home, watching the door every day. "Papa will come back," he told himself, even as his hope began to fade. Neighbors brought him food and comforted him, but Chimdi couldn't stop blaming himself. "Papa works too hard because of me," he thought. "He must be so tired." 2 weeks passed, and Emeka did not return. The villagers grew worried. They formed a search party and began looking for him. "He must be lost," they said. "Or maybe something terrible has happened." Chimdi begged to join the search, but the elders told him to stay behind. "We will find your father," they promised. The villagers combed the forest, calling his name. After hours of searching, one of them found his body lying beneath a tree. The man shouted, and the villagers rushed to the spot. They gasped as they saw him. He looked peaceful, as if he were sleeping, but he was cold and still. They tried to wake him, but nothing worked. Someone suggested taking his body back to the native doctor. The villagers carried Emeka's body carefully, their hearts heavy with worry. Chimdi ran to them as they entered the village, crying out for his father. The native doctor examined Emeka's body, his face dark with concern. He placed his hand on Emeka's forehead and closed his eyes, listening to the whispers of the spirit world. After a long silence, he shook his head. "His spirit is gone," he said gravely. "Death has taken him for good." The villagers gasped, and Chimdi collapsed into tears. The native doctor explained, "Emeka has been borrowing death for a long time. This time, death refused to give him back." The villagers were shocked by the native doctor's words. "Borrowing death? What does that mean?" they asked. The native doctor explained how Emeka had struck a deal with death to escape his pain. He wanted peace, but in doing so he left behind his responsibilities. Death warned him, but he kept returning until his time finally ran out. The villagers were silent, their hearts heavy with grief. They couldn't believe Emeka had been hiding such a secret. Chimdi blamed himself for his father's choices. "It's my fault," he sobbed. "He was tired because of me." A kind woman in the village, Mama Nkiru, held him close and said, "No, my child. Your father loved you so much that he tried to carry the weight of the world. But this was not your fault. He made his own choices." Chimdi listened, but the guilt stayed with him, a shadow he couldn't escape. Emeka's body was buried the next day under a tall tree near the village. The villagers gathered around his grave, their faces full of sorrow. The native doctor spoke to them, his voice firm but kind. "Let Emeka's story be a lesson to us all. Life is full of struggles, but death is not the answer. When we are alive, we have hope. Things can change in just one day. But in death, there are no second chances." The villagers nodded, taking the native doctor's words to heart. They realized how much they had taken life for granted. Many of them had seen their own struggles as too much to bear, but Emeka's story reminded them to be grateful for the gift of life. They promised to support one another, helping those who were struggling so that no one else would feel the need to borrow death. After Emeka's burial, the villagers began telling his story to everyone, especially to the children. They wanted to teach them that even though life could be hard, there was always a chance for things to get better. When you're alive, you can fight, you can hope, and you can dream, they would say. But in death, everything stops. There is no more hope. Chimdi was taken in by Mama Nkiru, a kind and generous woman who had always cared for others in the village. She cooked for him, told him stories, and tried her best to make him smile. But no matter how much she loved him, Chimdi could not stop missing his father. Every night he cried quietly, wondering if he had caused his father to borrow death so often. "Papa left because of me," he whispered to himself. Mama Nkiru noticed Chimdi's sadness and decided to talk to him. One evening, she sat beside him as he stared at the moon. "Chimdi, your father loved you more than anything," she said softly. "He tried to rest because life was hard, but that was never your fault. You were the reason he kept coming back. He fought to stay alive for you." Chimdi wiped his tears and nodded, though the guilt still lingered in his heart. Life slowly moved on in the village. The people worked together to ensure no one was left struggling like Emeka had been. If a family was short on food, the others shared what they had. If someone was overwhelmed, the villagers came to help. They realized they were stronger together and that kindness and community could ease even the hardest burdens. They didn't want anyone to feel like they had no choice but to escape. Chimdi grew stronger under Mama Nkiru's care, but he still visited his father's grave every week. He brought flowers he picked from the fields and sat by the tree, talking to Emeka as if he could hear him. "Papa, I'm doing well," he would say. "Mama Nkiru is kind, but I miss you. I will make you proud." The villagers often saw him there and felt both sorrow and pride for the boy who carried his father's love in his heart. One day, Chimdi decided to build a small shrine near his father's grave. It was a place where people could come to remember Emeka and reflect on the value of life. He carved his father's name into a stone and placed flowers around it. "This is for Papa," he said. The villagers began visiting the shrine often, leaving small offerings of fruit or lighting candles as they prayed for strength and hope in their own lives. The story of Emeka's deal with death even spread to neighboring villages. Travelers came to Igwe to hear about the man who had borrowed death and to see the shrine his son had built. People marveled at how much he had loved his family and how his story had inspired the village to live differently. "He taught us to appreciate life," the villagers would say. "No matter how hard things are, there is always hope." Chimdi grew into a wise and generous man, often sharing his father's story with children and visitors alike. "My father made a mistake," he would say, "but through his struggles, he taught us that running from problems does not solve them. We must face life with courage and lean on each other when things get tough." Over time, Igwe became known as a haven for kindness and community support. No one was left to struggle alone. If someone needed food, shelter, or comfort, the villagers came together to provide it. They built a strong community where love and unity were more valuable than gold. Emeka's legacy lived on for generations. His story became a legend, told around fires and in schools, a reminder of the value of life and the strength of a supportive community. His son's shrine remained a place of hope and remembrance, and the villagers never forgot the lesson he had taught them, that life, no matter how difficult, is a precious gift worth cherishing.